biography is very, very long, but I'm going to I'd like to introduce him to you. Alex has been a member of Amnesty International since 1985 and has served as Secretary General of Amnesty International Canada, the English branch, since 2000. In that role, he has carried out numerous human rights research missions throughout Africa and Latin America, and closer to home in such locations as Grassy Narrows First Nation in northwestern Ontario, and to Guantanamo Bay. He speaks to audiences across the country about a wide range of human rights issues, appears regularly before parliamentary committees and UN bodies, and is a frequent commentator in the media. Alex is a lawyer with an LLB from Dalhousie University and a master's degree in international human rights law from the University of Essex. He has served as a member of the Immigration and Refugee Board, taught at Osgoode Hall Law School and the University of Ottawa, been affiliated with York University Centre for Refugee Studies, and worked as a refugee lawyer in private practice and in a community legal aid clinic. He is on the board of directors of Partnership Africa Canada, the Canadian Centre for International Justice, and the Centre for Law and Democracy. Alex has been named an Officer of the Order of Canada and the Trudeau Foundation Mentor. He is a recipient of Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal. He has received honorary doctorate law degrees from St. Thomas University, the University of Waterloo, and the University of New Brunswick. So without further ado, floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the warm welcome, and it's a tremendous honor to be with you here this afternoon for something that's so special, that has such special meaning, and it was lovely to hear more about that in the introduction, and I think it sets the stage and the spirit so powerfully for what I want to share with you today. I'm not going to start off in a happy place. I'm going to start off by suggesting to you that we come together this afternoon amidst very grim and troubling times for human rights in this world of ours. Not at all a light and cheerful way perhaps to begin, but I'm also going to go out on a limb and say that I expect there's probably no one here who would disagree with that assessment of our world, and in fact, quite clearly many of you care deeply about that and are doing all you can to confront and address that reality. And we're certainly not alone in having that level of concern about our planet. When the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Zeid Ra'ad Al Hussein, gave his opening address to the UN's Human Rights Council this past September, he chose a title meant to capture that worry and foreboding that pervades the human rights community. The title of his speech was "Darker and More Dangerous." That said a lot. I remember really being struck with it at the time. He didn't entitle it "Dark and Dangerous." It was darker and more dangerous. And we can, of course, look around the world and are easily reminded of many situations that highlight why that is an apt description of our world right now. Think of just these two, South Sudan and Yemen. Stark reminders indeed, two staggering human rights and humanitarian catastrophes that have unfolded for several years now, seeming to attract little more than a batted eyelid of international attention from time to time. Armed conflict in both countries that has claimed lives, of course, and then has also fueled and exacerbated terrible famine. Arms flow to all sides to the conflicts in both countries, totally unabated. Abuses against civilians are not just a side effect, but the very hallmark of what those conflicts are all about. Until the crisis erupted last year in Myanmar, South Sudan had become the source of the world's fastest growing refugee crisis, with between 1,000 and 2,000 refugees arriving daily in neighboring Uganda alone, now home to well over 1 million South Sudanese refugees. And Yemen faces a humanitarian blockade and a cholera epidemic now, understood to be the worst, not just the worst last year or the worst in 5 years. Public health officials, the WHO, are saying the Yemen cholera epidemic is the worst the world has ever seen. Why is that not on the front pages of every newspaper every single day? It certainly isn't. Well, here I am to deliver the Hrant Dink Memorial Lecture, so it's impossible not to turn our mind as well to Turkey, which has, of course, been in the grips of a full-blown human rights crisis that seems to know no end ever since the failed coup attempt in July of 2016, and obviously many human rights concerns prior to that. This recent crackdown has been unrelenting and has ensnared hundreds of thousands of people from all walks of life, including civil servants, lawyers, judges, teachers, professors, journalists, academics. Turkish jails overflow with prisoners, rounded up on the most tenuous and spurious of charges and allegations. And amongst others, that now includes a staggering 144 journalists, meaning that there are more journalists behind bars in Turkey than in any other country anywhere in this world. And there is some pretty notorious competition for that title. And Turkey has held it for over a year now. It says a lot. Repression of minorities, of course, continues. Today, in fact, news that a Turkish military campaign has begun against Kurdish-held areas of Syria. Doesn't take much to imagine that that's not going to be good news. And as many of you will know, the crackdown in Turkey has become deeply personal for Amnesty International. In an unprecedented, and I really want to emphasize that, unprecedented move, both the chair and the director of Amnesty International's national section in Turkey were locked up last year, alongside 9 other highly respected human rights leaders. Never, ever in our 56 years have we ever faced such a deliberate move against Amnesty International by the leader of any country anywhere. And it's with cruel irony that this came from a leader who once upon a time was an Amnesty International prisoner of conscience himself. He was welcome. He welcomed our campaigning when it was for his rights and his freedom, and then when it suited political ends, decided to move against us and clamp down on our rights. Our director, Idil Esser, was released after 3.5 months, released but not free. Her trial on absolutely outrageous and unfounded allegations of supporting terrorism continues. And as we gather here this afternoon, our chair, Taner Kilic, who alongside his devoted volunteer efforts with Amnesty International is a human rights lawyer, is still imprisoned, going on to close to 8 months now. The message is a pretty clear one. In Turkey today, defending human rights is a crime. And that highlights a wider, deeply disturbing global human rights trend as well. Frontline human rights defenders everywhere find it more perilous than ever simply to stand up for human rights in their communities. I'm going to come back to that. So yes, a world of turmoil and divisiveness. The Mediterranean Sea, Mexican rainforests, continue to be places of ever greater danger for refugees and migrants, braving journeys fueled by equal parts hope and desperation. And around the world, from the United States to the Philippines and far too many other countries, toxic bigotry and the politics of fear, suspicion, and hate now win elections and set government agendas by unabashedly vilifying and targeting marginalized communities. And here, closer to home in Canada, great expectations that a long overdue national inquiry into the staggering levels of violence over many decades against Indigenous women and girls in this country would finally lead to progress in addressing one of our most serious and neglected human rights problems now hangs in the balance as the inquiry itself is increasingly hampered by internal problems, and all the while Indigenous women and girls continue to experience violence and continue to go missing. And I could go on, but that's just a very quick tour of a few concerns in our global human rights landscape. So yes, these are tough times for human rights indeed. Not to suggest at all that that's the first time I've ever said those words. I could probably have been here giving you a talk 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and might have begun with the same opening refrain. But there is something particularly heavy about what we've seen in 2017, and something particularly disheartening about that happening at a time when in this world of ours we should be welcoming gains, shouldn't we? Not lamenting setbacks. It's not a surprise then that many women, men, and young people around the world roundly condemn the failure of governments to live up to the grand vision and promise of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Crafted in the raw and determined aftermath of the Second World War 7 decades ago now. That's kind of notable. Just sit with that number for a minute. It has been 7 decades. The Universal Declaration will turn 70 this year. So I'm going to suggest to you that with the bleak global context I've just pointed to, and that upcoming platinum, that's what you get at 70, platinum anniversary, that there's really no better time for us and all people around the world who share our concerns to recommit to pushing for a renewed, strengthened global agenda for human rights protection. And that's what I'd like to take some time to explore with you this afternoon. I'm obviously going to do it only in a very partial way, because if I was going to be true to what a meaningful, comprehensive, renewed global human rights agenda would look like, I'd take up the rest of your weekend. I've only got 40 minutes or so. But let me touch on a handful of issues that I think do absolutely need our very committed and passionate attention this year and over the years to come, and which come together to point the way forward to strengthen human rights protection in Turkey, in Canada, in Yemen, in South Sudan. Ending atrocities, protecting people on the move, upholding the equality rights of women and girls, defending the defenders, and enforcing the promises. I'm going to start with ending atrocities. I think it's probably safe to say that in many respects, one of the most disgraceful failures of the International Human Rights Project over these past 70 years has been what can only be described as an abject inability and an utter unwillingness to end mass atrocities in this world of ours, so that there would be no repetition of the horrors of the Holocaust that had provided the very impetus for the Universal Declaration and the whole dream of international human rights in the first place. But no, here we are 70 years later, and very sadly that global human rights commitment of never again has instead, over those many decades, become again and again and again. Be it carnage against civilians in armed conflict, or deliberate campaigns of killings and enforced disappearances, the list of countries, which you all know and carry in your hearts, grows long and is a chilling indictment of the very worst of inhumanity. And still it goes on. In 2017, it goes on. Witness the massive ethnic cleansing and crimes against humanity that have propelled over 650,000 Rohingya refugees to flee from Myanmar, to flee their devastated, burned to the ground, destroyed villages into neighboring, impoverished Bangladesh over the course of only a few months. So what does this tell us? That mass human rights violations are simply unavoidable and inevitable, part of being human, and it's beyond us as a collective global community to do anything about it? Clearly not. It most certainly would not be the response from the hundreds of millions of women, men, and children whose lives and rights are on the line. And it's also not reflected in the deep anguish and sympathy and concern that you feel, that so many people feel, when a human rights or humanitarian crisis becomes known. We know it is wrong. So what needs to change? That too would take the rest of the weekend, and the building blocks of a global agenda for atrocities prevention have been coming together for many, many years now. And really what is needed at the heart of it is political will to move it forward. But let me touch just quickly on two key components of ending atrocities, and that is upholding international justice and committing to arms control. For decades, one of the most notable shortcomings in international human rights protection was the glaring absurdity. Just think about it this way for a moment. That we've lived in a world where the world's worst criminals were the ones most likely to escape justice and accountability for their crimes. That someone who beat up one person in a back alley brawl was more likely to face justice than a police commander who oversaw the systematic torture of thousands. That someone who murdered one person was more likely to go to jail than a president who orchestrated the mass killing of hundreds of thousands of his own people. Well, all of that was supposed to change with the historic breakthrough of agreeing to the Rome Statute back in 1998, 20 years ago this year, which subsequently led to the establishment of the International Criminal Court in 2002. But here we are 20 years later, and what's the state of play? Well, 124 countries. Not bad, that's close to 2/3 of the world's states, including Canada, but not Turkey, are now parties to the Rome Statute. That is a remarkable level of support for a concept, international justice, that governments did not even want to discuss for decades. And that in itself gives us hope. However, there's a however coming. 3 of the permanent members of the Security Council who wield great power, and you know which 3, don't you? China, Russia, the United States, have not signed on and have made it very clear that they have absolutely no intention of doing so. And in more recent years, there has been growing pushback from African governments, including several who have been party to the Rome Statute for many years, but who now allege that the court has disproportionately targeted Africa in its first round of charges and trials. So lots of challenge. But I think we should also look at this as glass half full, because in a certain way, all of that consternation and pushback and criticism and resistance is in itself perhaps one of the strongest indications there is that this matters. And if anything, should encourage us to dig deeper and become even more passionate champions of this notion of international justice. The other issue, arms control. Well, human rights and humanitarian groups have long known that one of the most obvious obstacles to preventing atrocities has been the unregulated and unbridled global arms trade. The ease with which weapons move across international borders and into the hands of governments and armed groups ready to commit terrible human rights violations in this world of ours is absolutely stunning. The need for established rules and oversight of the global arms trade is all the more pressing given the inability of states to come together when a particular conflict arises and do something about arms in that context at that moment. They never can. For instance, right now, there is no comprehensive UN Security Council imposed arms embargo with respect to Yemen, with respect to South Sudan, with respect to Syria, and now with respect to Myanmar. They can never do it in the moment. We need the treaty that will stand over all of that and ensure that this just simply becomes the norm of how arms are sold and transferred in this world of ours. Well, after years of research, advocacy, and campaigning by civil society groups, states did, at long last, adopt an arms trade treaty in April of 2013. It was momentous. Even just 5, 6, 7 years before that, states were saying that groups like Amnesty and Oxfam and others that were dreaming of this were lunatic, that states would never even come to the negotiating table to start talking about it. And in April 2013, there we were, we had the treaty. And even better, close to 5 years later now, a respectable 94 countries are on board, have actually bound themselves to this new treaty. And those of you who follow the UN will know that 94 countries in 5 years is getting pretty close to light speed within the United Nations. That's actually encouraging. Now here we go. Of course, the same three, China, Russia, the United States, are staying out. That comes as no surprise. Though, and this is a notable though, under President Obama, the United States did at least take the first symbolic, but still meaningful, step of signing the treaty. Similarly, Turkey has signed, but not gone the distance and ratified the arms trade treaty. There is without question, therefore, still far to go in ensuring that the ATT will become the effective bulwark that is needed against atrocities, and that it can be. But given that only 10 years ago, as I say, most observers thought this was completely unattainable, we are actually getting somewhere. Now let's bring this question a little closer to home for a minute. 94 states, I told you. Does anyone think, I'm sure we all hope, does anyone think Canada's part of the 94? I see some shaking heads. I don't see any nodding heads. We're not. But we're getting close. Now, Stephen Harper's government had made it absolutely clear that they were entirely disinterested, and he didn't even go that first step that President Obama did and symbolically sign the treaty. But Justin Trudeau pledged in the 2015 election campaign, that was over 2 years ago now, that Canada would become a party to the ATT. So you're probably asking yourselves, what is it now, 27 months later, what's with that promise? Well, there's a couple of things going on here. First, there's been that distracting inconvenience of both Harper and Trudeau governments having approved $15 billion worth of light armored vehicles for sale to Saudi Arabia at a time when Saudi forces, this is going to go back to my opening remarks, lead a coalition that is committing widespread war crimes in neighboring Yemen. That's why Amnesty International has called on all governments around the world not to sell arms to Saudi Arabia that could risk ending up in Yemen at this time. But second, we needed law reform before we can get on board with the Arms Trade Treaty. Well, that finally came with Bill C-47, which was tabled in the House of Commons in June of last year. Progress, I ask. Only in theory. Because there's problems. Bill C-47, sadly, is wholly inadequate for a number of reasons, but I just want to share one big, glaring one with you. It would exempt any arms transfers from Canada to the United States from arms control scrutiny. That's problematic for a whole host of reasons. It's problematic because of quantity. More than half of our arms sales go to the United States, so we'd be signing on to this UN treaty while excluding from the scope of that treaty more than half of the relevant subject matter. Doesn't exactly scream good faith. But it's problematic for very substantive reasons as well. I can imagine that most of you would agree with me that the United States has a rather problematic record when it comes to what it does, when it comes to selling, transferring, otherwise giving arms to countries around the world. And we therefore do need to be scrupulous. We do need to bring scrutiny to that trade. So this doesn't exactly add up. If we are going to be in with the Arms Trade Treaty, which we absolutely must and should be, we need to be fully in, not halfway in. And it's not too late. That law has not been passed. Bill C-47 is still before the House of Commons right now. It hasn't even gone on to the Senate. So if that concerns you, if that worries you, please do join us in calling for Canada to get it right when it comes to global arms control. I now want to move on to the second area of concern I highlighted, which was protecting people on the move. And there's a linkage here. Mass atrocities, people on the move. And at a time when situations of widespread human rights violations are so glaringly commonplace around the world, and, as I've noted, meaningful and effective efforts to address those situations, dismal at best, it is not at all a surprise, therefore, that the world faces levels of forced displacement not seen, not experienced since the Second World War. Just ask Turkey. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees estimates that 65 million people have now been forced to flee their homes worldwide, with approximately 23 million refugees, so they've fled across the border into another country, and 42 to 43 million internally displaced people who are still trapped, haven't been able to cross that border, and are therefore amongst the most vulnerable of all displaced people. Those are pretty staggering numbers, and here's a simple number that puts it into a bit of context. That means now that 1 out of every 112 people on this planet has been forced to flee from their home. Think of that for a moment. 1 out of every 112 people forced to flee from their homes. There is, therefore, understandably much talk of a global refugee crisis. The situation for Syrian refugees in particular, with well over 5 million women, men, and children now sheltering in a handful of neighboring countries, particularly Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, is certainly at the fore. And the launch of the military campaign in Kurdish-held areas today by Turkish forces will not help that. But other crises, such as the recent Rohingya situation and the mass exodus of South Sudanese refugees, are also of grave concern. Meanwhile, governments, the media, and the general public continue to conflate refugees and migrants. Bringing it closer to home, that's particularly the case in this hemisphere, with the many thousands, tens of thousands of people fleeing the so-called Northern Triangle of Central American states, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, through Mexico in an attempt to reach the United States, and even perhaps onwards to Canada, where they're going to find a rather closed border. They are treated abysmally by all governments along the way, and their plight is often somehow dismissed, relegated, put into a separate corner over here that we don't need to be concerned because they're not refugees, which many of them are, but they're not refugees, they're illegals, they're migrants, so we need not worry. So yes, there's a sense of crisis in all of that, but what I would suggest to you that the crisis actually much more urgently lies not so much in those numbers or the plight of people as they flee, but it lies in the measures being taken by governments in response to this situation, with far more focus and resources on restrictions and barriers and punishment than on protection, compassion, and assistance. As such, desperate individuals and families increasingly take terrifying risks on the high seas, over mountain passes, across scorching deserts, and through dense rainforests, hoping to reach safety, but along the way, thousands are now paying with their lives. There are many explanations for this crisis, but one clear problem is that the global refugee system, which from the outset was intended to be entirely grounded in international cooperation, is at its heart entirely unilateral. There's nothing cooperative about it. Frontline states are the ones to receive, who are the ones to receive an influx of refugees, are then the ones expected to shoulder that responsibility. You were the neighbor, good luck. It's your responsibility. With an unpredictable degree of generally woefully inadequate charitable assistance from the international community, which is never predictable. There's no formula for what that assistance will or will not be, and no obligations or demands that it be the same from crisis to crisis. States further afield, with the resources to do so, are able to expend huge sums, which generally far outstrip the amounts they devote to protection and assistance, to border control, ocean patrols, and other measures, all aimed at one thing and one thing only, keeping refugees away. There had been hope that governments were going to make headway in agreeing to a more cooperative approach to refugee protection, including a binding framework for more equitable responsibility sharing at a major UN summit back in September of 2016. Didn't happen. But a 2-year process of further negotiations, that sounds so UN, doesn't it, was agreed to at the time and is underway even now as we gather. And that is slated to come back to the UN General Assembly in September of 2018. Expectations are not high. As we just look around us in the world when it comes to refugees, most states continue to exhibit narrow self-interest over principled humanitarianism. Nonetheless, this is the window of time that offers us the best hope, the best chance in decades to get governments to at least move the needle a little bit towards some greater commitments to cooperation and solidarity when it comes to refugees. Let's turn to upholding the equality rights of women and girls. By sheer numbers alone, there is no denying that the deep inequality faced by women and girls is the most severe human rights challenge the world faces, and faces everywhere. Despite commitments, many of them to gender equality and safeguards for upholding women's human rights being long enshrined in numerous treaties, conventions, declarations, principles, resolutions, the pile would grow and grow very quickly if I was to throw all of those documents in front of you right now. But despite all of that, violence, inequality, marginalization continue to be the human rights reality for women and girls the world over. And while the scale the nature of the abuses differs considerably, there is no denying that this is indeed a concern everywhere. Be it the global north, the global south, within all religions, cultural and political traditions, in countries considered to be wealthy, in countries facing high levels of extreme poverty. It's beyond debate that upholding the rights of women and girls matters, and matters fundamentally for so many reasons. Just think of these two. First and most pressing, and just so obviously, is the fact that the rights violations are serious, widespread, and indefensible, and simply must be stopped. That the equality, dignity, and well-being of not just millions or hundreds of millions, but billions of women and girls around the world is so readily daily disregarded and with such entrenched impunity that there's never any consequences, is a disgrace. But second, more broadly, it is well established that systematic discrimination against women and girls has far broader human rights, social, and economic impact as well. Respecting women's human rights is beneficial across society, be it more effective protection for other marginalized groups, increased prosperity and well-being, and stronger commitments to peace and security. Global determination to promote gender equality and women's human rights continues to grow. In 2010, the UN General Assembly created UN Women, a significant step within the UN system. The UN's important Sustainable Development Goals, or Agenda 2013, includes a specific goal focused on gender equality, which many states have chosen to be the goal they are prioritizing above all others, and in fact mainstreaming in how they implement the SDGs. Well, determination may be on the upswing, but there is still very far to go when it comes to changes and action that make a real difference. Some states are at long last giving women's equality the priority attention it requires, both domestically and internationally. Canada, of course, recently adopted our Feminist International Assistance Policy. Some struggles, such as the effort to promote the rights of girls to education, championed by Nobel laureate Malala Yousafzai, and now the momentum that has built around the Me Too movement are attracting greater support. Such advances, though sadly, are still the exception and not the rule. A renewed global human rights agenda must have efforts to protect the rights of women and girls at its very heart. And that's, of course, why, at this very moment, blocks away from us, but around the world as well, women and men are in the streets for the Women's March, yet again, spurred into action last year by Donald Trump and his well-known views on women's rights, but sustained, obviously, 1 year later by the belief that this is a matter of tremendous global importance. I want to come to my fourth point, which you may remember was defending the defenders. Back in 1998, almost 20 years ago, marking International Human Rights Day, the UN adopted what's come to be known as the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders. And in many respects, it was meant to be a moment of celebration. It's quite something to think back to that now. Acknowledging the strength and vibrancy of activists within the burgeoning global human rights movement around the world, and an opportunity for governments to reaffirm the importance of respecting and supporting their work. Well, unfortunately, almost 2 decades since the Declaration was adopted, regard for the work of human rights defenders around the world has not at all consolidated and improved. Quite the contrary, it has deteriorated precipitously, such that a vocation and calling that should be among the most cherished in our world has now become amongst the most perilous. The measures may differ: legal harassment, public demonization, imprisonment, threats, physical attacks, disappearances, killings, but the message is the same. standing up for human rights carries a price. This is a deeply troubling trend on two levels. Clearly, it is terribly worrying that a growing number of people of all ages face growing risk of human rights violations simply because they care about human rights. And there are some who are at even greater risk than others, including those who defend the rights of the LGBTI community, defenders who uphold the sexual and reproductive health and rights of women and girls, and activists who speak up about human rights in the context of land and environmental struggles. More widely, of course, greater danger for those who seek to defend human rights reflects growing contempt for the rights they strive to defend. And that jeopardizes us all. So no global human rights agenda can or will succeed without a legion of young people, women and men, actively and passionately defending those rights by mobilizing, educating, researching, advocating, by agitating. And it's time for governments to turn the spotlight on celebrating the courage and accomplishment of human rights defenders while roundly condemning any efforts to silence their voices. I'm speaking to you, President Erdogan. Let me come to my last point now, enforcing the promises. For years, the international community has focused the bulk of its human rights efforts on elaborating the fine promises. And I do mean that, fine promises. Some of them are poetic in their beauty and their majesty, as governments have put these promises to paper over the years and decades. And they're out there now in a never-ending array of legal instruments. They have spent so much time talking about those promises, crafting those promises, and even lamenting the fact that we're not really living up to the promises. But despite the advances, that important end goal of enforcing, complying, implementing those promises, of turning talk into action, remains elusive at best, would be a generous way to describe it. Now, I could now deaden your senses with talk of UN treaties, multilateral processes, give you a little lecture on the various levels of international law. I'm not going to do that. I just want to highlight two particular instances where promises are regularly broken and where I think we need to give some particular attention. Because progress in strengthening human rights enforcement absolutely requires paying close attention to these areas where implementation and compliance are weakest and where excuses abound for failing to live up to obligations. Those are the areas that directly challenge and therefore insidiously undermine the universal nature of the human rights promise. National security. Well, national security arguments have been a particularly notorious challenge to human rights principles, particularly since the September the 11th terrorist attacks in the United States. But I can assure you, in Amnesty International's reporting, we were tracking this as a serious concern for decades before that. The US government, while infamous for disregarding human rights as part of the so-called war on terror, is by no means the only state to do so, and it is certainly not a concern limited to the post-September the 11th environment. In some instances, national security is used as a pretext to disguise repressive measures that are clearly directed at targeting political opponents, civil society, media, religious, racial, or ethnic minorities, and other groups. Witness, Turkey today. In other cases, governments do legitimately perhaps face terrorist or security threats, but willingly pursue responses that officially allow or unofficially tolerate widespread human rights violations, particularly with respect to arbitrary imprisonment, torture, unfair trials, and discrimination. In both cases, it has led us to a place where a mere reference to national security means human rights will certainly face an uphill battle. More political opposition, greater public uncertainty, and a receptive judiciary in some instances. And that corrosive impact erodes the human rights framework more generally and certainly sets back efforts to encourage and strengthen implementation. So central to a new human rights enforcement agenda must be adoption of an approach to national security that embraces rights obligations as central to, not antithetical, central to security, security that is truly equitable and durable. And then the one other arena that I wanted to touch on in which human rights advocates are constantly told to wait, be patient, is when economic interests are on the line. Doing business just always somehow seems to take precedence. But we're told that's a good thing because it will eventually inevitably lead to greater prosperity, stronger respect for the rule of law, more opportunities for education, training, and employment, and therefore, ultimately, at the end of the day, human rights will flourish. But we know that is far too simple, and more to the point, often not the case. A country's economy can grow and expand considerably while human rights violations do not abate, and in fact, even worsen. Consider China and Saudi Arabia as two glaring examples of economic boom and human rights bust. Trade policy, trade arrangements that do not deliberately incorporate and commit to human rights obligations do little favor to rights or justice. And the companion to trade agreements that also ignores human rights is a business world that far too often shows contempt for rights. In an ever smaller world, companies now operate in virtually every corner, including on the edge of war zones against backdrops of severe human rights violations and surrounded by corruption. Many companies have much more clout and greater resources than local and sometimes even national governments. But what of their human rights responsibilities? If they operate responsibly, they may help considerably in the effort to bolster human rights, but the opposite is true as well. Irresponsible business practices can and do cause serious human rights abuses. So a renewed global human rights agenda that does not endeavor to make significant strides in strengthening enforcement of the human rights responsibilities of companies will truly miss the mark. A key initiative at this time, an effort to elaborate a binding treaty on business and human rights, continues to face a blend of disinterest, opposition, and enthusiasm from a range of different governments. And here at home, well, Canada's announcement this week, hot off the presses just a few days ago, of a new Canadian ombudsperson for responsible enterprise backed up by a multi-stakeholder advisory body on responsible enterprise, which Amnesty International is even going to be part of. Something we've been pushing for 10 years is a tremendous step in the right direction. All right, I'm there, ready to wrap up. I've taken you on quite a tour, and I've pointed to 5 areas, 5 imperatives, if you will. There are many others that really need to be central to a renewed effort to doing something about this world of turmoil and division we face. Preventing mass atrocities, protecting people on the move, upholding the rights of women and girls, defending human rights defenders, and enforcing the promises. At the end of the day, all of these important measures aside, perhaps the most crucial and challenging imperative of all, though, is the need to build empathy and understanding and to foster a culture that celebrates diversity and aspires to tolerance and inclusion. It's the flip side of the waves of division and hate and bigotry that have certainly always existed but have become more global and mainstream than ever. this need for human rights empathy takes us back, and I want to close with these words. The powerful remarks delivered by Eleanor Roosevelt at the United Nations back in 1958. I don't know what the math is. I guess that's 60 years ago, isn't it? And these words, I think it's really notable, at least to me, speak so evocatively to our time, and obviously did back in 1958 as well. This was Eleanor Roosevelt talking about the small places where human rights truly take root. Where, after all, do universal rights begin? In small places, close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood she lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory, farm, or office where she works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. Without concerned citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world. So with Eleanor Roosevelt and those small places in mind, I thank you for the opportunity to be here with you this afternoon. And I know this is a group that will join all of us in going forward in that vision of creating the world of universal human rights protection. It may be 70 years on, but we will get there. Thank you so much.
Inspiring and thought-provoking, truly thought-provoking talk. We have 15 minutes to take, not to take questions, for